The silence between them had gone on so long that the auctioneer, old Pete Calloway, had actually sat down on an upturned log and pulled out his pocket watch for the third time in an hour. Nobody left. Nobody breathed wrong, because everyone standing in the high pine-scented air of the Bitterroot Valley timber sale knew that what was happening between Etta Monroe and Hugh Townsend was not simply a negotiation over board feet of lumber. It was something older than that. Something that smelled like pride and gunpowder, and an argument that had started before either of them had opened their mouths that morning. Hugh stood with his arms crossed over his chest, which was a broad and considerable chest, the kind built by 15 years of cutting timber, hauling freight, and refusing to bend. His jaw was set hard enough to crack walnut shells. He had not moved in 40 minutes. His boots were planted in the pine needle duff like fence posts driven deep, and his dark eyes were fixed on Etta Monroe with an expression that was equal parts fury and something he had not yet named, even to himself. Etta had not moved either. She stood across the clearing with her survey notebook tucked under her arm and her hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, and she was looking at him with the calm, patient expression of a woman who had studied every tree in that stand, who had counted every ring in every stump, who had walked every acre of that slope twice before this sale was ever announced. She had a number in her head. It was a fair number. It was a number arrived at through calculation and knowledge, and a kind of fierce, quiet certainty that made the men watching from the edges of the clearing shift uncomfortably on their feet, because most of them had not arrived at any number through anything more rigorous than guesswork and wanting. Hugh Townsend had named his price first, a number so far from hers that a murmur had gone through the gathered bidders. He had named it, and then he had looked at her as though daring her to flinch. She had not flinched. She had named her price in return, and that was when the waiting had begun. The year was 1887. The place was the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory, where the timber was thick, and the winters were long, and the men who dealt in board feet of Douglas fir and western larch were accustomed to getting what they wanted. The Northern Pacific Railroad had pushed its tracks through just a few years earlier, and suddenly the timber of these mountains was worth a great deal more than it had ever been worth before, because the railroad needed ties, and the towns along the railroad needed buildings, and the mines up in the buttes needed shoring timbers, and the whole engine of western expansion was hungry and loud, and it ate wood the way fire ate kindling. Into this world, 6 months before the day of the timber sale, Etta Monroe had arrived in the valley driving her own wagon. She had come from Oregon, from a family that had been in the timber business since before she was born. Her father, Joseph Monroe, had been one of the first licensed timber cruisers in the Oregon Territory, a man who could walk into a stand of old-growth fir and tell you within 5% exactly how many board feet of merchantable timber it contained. He had taught his daughter everything he knew. He had started teaching her when she was 8 years old, walking her through the forests of the Coast Range with a notebook in her small hands, showing her how to measure a tree's diameter at breast height, how to use the Biltmore stick, how to estimate crown ratio and form class and site index. He had treated her like an apprentice, because his sons had died young of fever and she was what he had, and because he had quickly realized that she had a gift for it that outstripped his own. By the time Etta was 18, she could cruise timber more accurately than any man in the valley. By the time she was 22, she had her own notation system, refined over years of field work, that let her produce a timber inventory faster and more precisely than the methods taught in the Eastern forestry schools that were just beginning to produce trained professionals. By the time she was 26, which was the age she was on the day of the timber sale in the Bitterroot, she had completed contracts for 3 separate timber operations in Oregon and had saved enough money to do what she had always wanted to do. She had wanted to be the one buying the timber, not just measuring it for someone else. She had come to Montana because the Bitterroot Valley still had uncut old-growth timber in the upper drainages, and because land in Montana was cheaper than in Oregon, and because she had a plan. The plan was simple in its bones and enormously difficult in its execution. She intended to purchase a standing timber sale, harvest it responsibly, sell the lumber to the railroad contractors who were desperate for supply, and use the profit to buy a small mill site she had already identified on a creek 3 miles west of the town of Stevensville. The mill site was the key. Everything else was the road to it. She had spent her first 2 months in the valley doing what she did best. She had walked every accessible drainage within 20 miles of Stevensville. She had surveyed, measured, estimated, and recorded. She had talked to the sawyers and the teamsters and the merchants in town, gathering the kind of ground-level market intelligence that no one thought to ask a woman for, which meant people talked to her freely, and she learned a great deal. She had introduced herself to the land office clerk and to the forest reserve supervisor, a quiet man named Alderton, who had been surprised by her professional knowledge and had treated her with cautious respect. And she had heard about the Calder Bench timber sale. The Calder Bench was a south-facing slope above the valley floor, approximately 300 acres of mature western larch and Douglas fir, timber that had been marked for sale by the Federal Land Office to help fund road improvements in the territory. The trees were large, accessible, and of exceptional quality. Etta had walked the bench herself, alone, over 2 long days in early April, and she had come back with a number in her notebook that was as precise as she could make it. She had also heard about Hugh Townsend. You could not spend 2 months in the Bitterroot Valley without hearing about Hugh Townsend. He was the largest private timber operator in the valley, the owner of a portable sawmill that moved seasonally through the upper drainages, and the man who had an established relationship with the 2 biggest railroad tie contractors working the Northern Pacific route. He employed 11 men directly and another 20 or more seasonally. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful figure in the valley's timber economy. He was also, everyone who mentioned him agreed, the most stubborn man in Montana territory. They said it with a kind of fond exasperation, the way people describe a weather pattern that is difficult but that they have made their peace with. Hugh Townsend would not be moved on price. He would not be moved on schedule. He would not be moved on method. He had a way of operating that he had developed through hard experience and considerable loss, and he had refined it until it worked, and he was not interested in changing it. He had put 3 smaller operators out of business not through malice, but simply by refusing to compete on terms that were not his own terms, which eventually left his competitors with nowhere to go. Etta had filed this information away carefully. She had also noted, with the same careful neutrality with which she noted the form class of a Douglas fir, that Hugh Townsend was 32 years old, unmarried, and that no woman in the valley had managed to maintain his interest beyond a season. The women of Stevensville attributed this to his stubbornness, his long hours, and a rumored dark past involving a woman back in Wisconsin who had broken something in him that had never fully healed. Etta found this information professionally irrelevant and personally none of her concern. She had met him for the first time in May at the land office, where they had both arrived on the same morning to examine the timber sale prospectus that Alderton had put out. They had stood on opposite sides of Alderton's narrow desk and looked at each other over the paperwork, and Hugh Townsend had taken one long look at her and said, with a kind of bored certainty, "Ma'am, this sale will require experienced timber operations. It's not work for a woman." Etta had looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she had said, "Thank you for the observation," and she had turned back to the prospectus and begun making notes. He had stood there for a moment, clearly expecting a different response, and then he had pulled up the other chair and sat down and begun reading the prospectus himself, and that was the beginning of it. They had spoken civilly to each other at the land office on 3 subsequent occasions, each time maintaining the careful distance of 2 people who had correctly identified each other as competition. Hugh had not repeated his comment about women and timber operations, but his manner had carried a consistent undertone of dismissal that Etta had found not insulting, exactly, but inaccurate, and she had decided that the most efficient response to inaccuracy was proof. The proof had come in June. Hugh had been on the Calder bench himself, scouting the timber, when Etta arrived to do her second walk of the property. He had not known she was coming. She had not known he would be there. They had met in the middle of the stand, in the cathedral quiet of a grove of ancient larch, and Hugh had been in the middle of counting paces to estimate an area, and he had stopped when he saw her and stood with his arms at his sides in a way that was not quite hostile but was definitely territorial. "You're measuring," she had said. "Scouting," he had said. "What are you using for your volume estimate?" she had asked, genuinely curious. He had told her, grudgingly, that he was using the Doyle log rule and a pace count area method, which was the standard approach of experienced timber buyers who lacked formal training. Etta had nodded. Then she had opened her notebook and shown him her work. She had not done it to show off. She had done it because she was a professional, and because she wanted the conversation to be substantive rather than territorial, and because she genuinely believed that accurate information served everyone better than guesswork. She had shown him her diameter measurements, her height estimates using her calibrated clinometer, her basal area calculations, her site index determination, her form class notes. She had shown him her running total and her methodology and the cross-checks she used to catch errors. Hugh Townsend had stood very still for a long time, looking at her notebook. Then he had looked at her, and his expression had changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was not the wide-eyed, theatrical astonishment of a man who had never imagined a woman could think. It was something quieter and more real than that. It was the expression of a man who had just encountered something he had not accounted for, something that required him to revise a calculation he thought he had already finished, and who was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that his previous calculation had been wrong. "Where did you learn this?" he had asked, and his voice had been different. The dismissal was gone. What remained was genuine. "My father," she had said. "He was a timber cruiser in Oregon for 30 years. He taught me from the time I could hold a Biltmore stick." Hugh had looked back at the notebook. "Your form class estimates," he had said slowly. "You're using a different correction factor than the standard tables." "I developed my own," she had said, "based on field work. The standard tables don't account adequately for the crown form of high-elevation larch. I've been testing my corrections for 4 years." Hugh had been quiet for another long moment. Then he had said very quietly, "Your volume estimate is going to be more accurate than mine." It was not quite an apology. It was not quite a concession. But it was honest, and Etta had discovered in that moment that she valued honesty in a man more than she had previously realized, because she had not encountered it often enough in the context of her professional knowledge to have formed the habit of expecting it. "Probably," she had said, "but your knowledge of logging operations and market conditions is likely more accurate than mine. We are measuring different things." He had looked at her sharply, as though testing whether she was being sarcastic. She had not been. She had meant it straightforwardly, as an assessment of relative competencies. Something in his face had shifted again, more deeply this time. They had walked out of the larch grove together, not quite companionably but no longer adversarially, and at the edge of the bench where the trail dropped back down toward the valley floor, Hugh Townsend had stopped and said, "I suppose I owe you an apology for what I said at the land office." "You do," Etta had said pleasantly, "but I will accept it." He had almost smiled. It had been the first time she had seen anything close to a smile on his face, and it had done something unexpected to the careful, professional arrangement of her thoughts, which she had noted with the same calm attention she brought to irregularities in her survey data, and then firmly set aside. The next 6 weeks had been extraordinary, in the quiet, accumulating way that significant things sometimes are. They had each continued their independent preparations for the timber sale, but they had begun, by degrees, to share information. Not strategies, because they were still competing, but information, the kind that benefited accuracy rather than advantage. Hugh had told her about the road conditions on the east side of the bench, which his teamster had surveyed. She had told him about the stand of larch on the north-facing pocket that her measurements suggested contained exceptional timber that was easy to miss on a quick walk. Neither of them acknowledged what they were doing. They simply did it, in the way that two people who respect each other's competence sometimes find themselves collaborating despite having every reason not to. They had begun meeting for coffee at the Stevensville Hotel on mornings when they were both in town. This had started because they had arrived at the hotel dining room at the same time on a Tuesday in early July, and the dining room had been crowded, and the only open table had been a small one near the window, and the hotel keeper's wife had seated them together before either of them could object. And they had drunk their coffee and talked about timber grades for 40 minutes, and both of them had been slightly late to their respective morning appointments, and neither of them had seemed to mind. After that it had become a habit, not an acknowledged habit, not a planned habit, simply a thing that happened and that both of them allowed to continue happening. The people of Stevensville noticed. Of course they noticed. A small valley town in 1887 Montana noticed everything, and what they noticed about Etta Monroe and Hugh Townsend was that they argued constantly, agreed on almost nothing, and spent an increasing amount of time in each other's company. The women who gathered at the milliner's shop on Tuesday afternoons had opinions about this. The men who gathered at Draper's hardware store on Saturday mornings had opinions about this. Old Pete Calloway, who had known Hugh for a decade, had told anyone who would listen that something was happening to Hugh Townsend that he had not seen happen to Hugh Townsend since Wisconsin, and that it was about time, and that the Monroe woman was the only person he had ever seen who could outstubborn Hugh when she had a mind to. Hugh himself would not have used the word happening. He would not have used any word for it, because he had developed, after Wisconsin, a habit of not naming things that scared him. And this scared him, in the same way that a very long drop scares a man who has fallen before, not because the drop is unfamiliar, but because it is precisely familiar, because he remembers exactly what the bottom feels like. Her name had been Carolyn. She had been the daughter of the mill owner Hugh had worked for in his early 20s in Wisconsin, back when he was a young man trying to build something from nothing, bright and ambitious, and not yet armored by experience. He had loved her honestly and completely, and he had believed that love was returned. He had been wrong. Carolyn had taken his plans and his dreams and his trust, and she had taken them directly to her father, who had used the information to undercut Hugh's first business venture before it was ever properly launched, and she had married a banker from Milwaukee the following spring. And Hugh had left Wisconsin with nothing but his skills and his fury and a deep, bone-settled conviction that opening yourself to a woman was a form of beautiful and ruinous self-destruction. He had been careful since then. Very careful. Etta Monroe made careful difficult. She had a way of being direct that cut through the protective layers he had built with such effort. She did not flatter or maneuver. She did not try to charm him. She spoke plainly, assessed clearly, and was utterly, remarkably unimpressed by his reputation, which was a thing no one in the valley had managed before, and which he found so disarming that he sometimes had to actively remember to maintain his guard. In August, 2 weeks before the timber sale, they had been riding back from the bench together, because they had both gone up to take final measurements, and the afternoon had stretched long and golden over the valley, and the smell of pine and dry grass had been heavy in the warm air, and Etta had been telling him about the mill site she had identified on the creek west of town, and her voice had had a quality in it that Hugh had not heard from her before, a quality of something beyond professionalism, a quality of genuine dreaming. "It is the right site," she had said. "The water volume is sufficient for the wheel I am planning, the gradient is correct, and the access to the road is good." If I can capitalize the operation correctly from this sale, I can have the mill operational before the winter of '88. She had been looking ahead as she spoke, her face tipped slightly upward with an expression Hugh could not have described and could not look away from. "You have it all planned," he had said. "I have always had it planned," she had said. "I have been working toward this for 8 years, since I was 18 years old." There had been a silence between them that was different from their usual silences, which were comfortable and professional. This silence had an edge to it, or perhaps not an edge, perhaps rather a softness, a kind of openness between them that neither of them had prepared for. Hugh had said, and he had not planned to say it, "I had plans once, when I was young." She had turned to look at him, she had not asked. She had simply waited in that way she had of waiting that was completely without pressure and completely irresistible. "They did not work out," he had said. "Someone I trusted made sure they did not." "Betrayal," she had said quietly. It was exactly the right word, and the precision of it had hit him in the chest like a closed fist. "Yes," he had said. "And you have not trusted since," she had said. Not as a question, as an observation, careful and accurate, the same quality she brought to reading a tree. He had not answered, but he had not looked away either. Etta had been quiet for a moment, looking out over the valley below them, and then she had said, "I understand caution, Hugh. I have had my own variety of it. Men in this business have tried to steal my work before. I had a contract in Oregon where the operator waited until I had completed the cruise, and then refused to pay me and filed my data under his own name. I took him to the territorial court and won, but it cost me most of what I would have earned and a great deal more than that." He had looked at her sharply. "Took my work," she had said. "My methodology, my numbers. He put his name on them and told the buyers I was just his assistant." Her voice had been level throughout this, the way a river is level in a deep channel, with the current invisible beneath the surface. "So I understand what it means to build something and have it taken by someone who decided they had a right to it." The thing that had gone through Hugh Townsend in that moment was something he would not examine directly for several weeks yet. But it was real and it was large, and it had rearranged something inside him that he had thought was fixed. They had ridden the rest of the way to town in a silence that was no longer professional or adversarial or careful. It was simply the silence of two people who had told each other a true thing and were letting it settle. And then the day of the timber sale had arrived. The sale was conducted on the ground, as was common practice for land office timber sales in Montana Territory in the 1880s, with the auctioneer present and the bidders gathered on the site itself. There were 7 bidders initially, but by mid-morning 4 had dropped out, their interest overcome by the mathematics of the situation, and by noon there were 3, and by 2 o'clock in the afternoon there were 2. Etta Monroe and Hugh Townsend. Old Pete Calloway had conducted hundreds of timber sales. He had never seen anything quite like this. He had never seen 2 bidders who both clearly knew the timber better than he did, who were clearly locked in a contest that had ceased to be entirely about the timber approximately 30 minutes after it had begun, and who were both so absolutely, magnificently, infuriatingly unwilling to move. The issue was not simply price. The issue, underneath the price, was something else entirely, something that had built over the summer through coffee at the hotel and rides up to the bench and shared notebooks, and the story about Wisconsin, and the story about the Oregon operator and the golden August afternoon, and that something else had arrived at the timber sale uninvited, and was making the bidding process significantly more complicated than any timber bidding process had any right to be. Etta's number was her number because she had calculated it precisely, and she knew it was right. She was not going to pay more than the timber was worth, not because of stubbornness, but because her mill plan depended on the correct margin, and she was not going to compromise the thing she had spent 8 years working toward. Hugh's number was his number because he was Hugh Townsend, and he did not move on price. But as the afternoon wore on and the light shifted, and Pete Calloway looked at his pocket watch for the 3rd time, and the gathered observers shuffled their feet, and Etta Monroe stood across the clearing as patient and steady as one of her old-growth larch. Something in Hugh's chest was doing something he had not authorized it to do. He was looking at her, and he was thinking about the mill on the creek and the 8 years of working towards something, and the stolen methodology in Oregon, and the way she had looked on the ridge in August with her face tipped up toward whatever she was dreaming of. And he was thinking about Carolyn, and about the difference between Carolyn and Etta Monroe, which was a difference so fundamental and so vast that he could not quite believe it had taken him this long to see it clearly. Carolyn had wanted what he had. Etta Monroe did not want what he had. She had her own. She had built her own from her father's teachings and her own considerable brain and 8 years of fierce, solitary, disciplined effort, and she was not standing in that clearing because of him or in relation to him in any way. She was standing there entirely on her own terms. He had been treating her as a threat, and she was a threat to his business, to his market position, to the careful, managed solitude he had lived in for a decade. But she was also something else. She was the only person he had met in years who was honest with him about what she knew and what she did not know, who did not perform for him or at him, who looked at his stubbornness the way she looked at a difficult sight condition, as a real thing to be understood and accounted for rather than as a wall to beat herself against. He uncrossed his arms. It was such a small movement that several of the watchers did not even notice it. But Pete Calloway noticed it, and the 2 men standing nearest to Hugh noticed it, and Etta Monroe, who had been watching him with the focused patience of a woman who had spent 8 years waiting for moments like this, noticed it. Hugh walked across the clearing. He walked slowly, with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who had made a decision and was moving to execute it, and Etta watched him come with an expression that gave away nothing except in her eyes, where something had gone very still and very attentive. He stopped in front of her. They were standing close, closer than the professional distance they had maintained for 6 months, and the pine-scented mountain air was warm around them, and the shadows were going long on the bench, and somewhere far up in the trees, a woodpecker was working at something with patient, rhythmic persistence. "Name your price," Hugh said. His voice was quiet and completely level. Etta studied him for a moment. "You understand what I am saying when I name it," she said. "I understand it better than you know," he said. She named it. Hugh Townsend looked at her for one more long moment. Then he turned to Pete Calloway and said, in a voice that carried clearly across the clearing, "The sale goes to Miss Monroe at that price. I withdraw my bid." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a group of people who are collectively processing something they did not expect and are not sure they have understood correctly. Then Pete Calloway, who had been waiting for this moment for the better part of 4 hours and who had a dinner to get home to, said "sold," and wrote the number in his ledger, and that was that. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no immediate declaration, no sudden embrace in the middle of a timber sale clearing with 11 witnesses and Pete Calloway still holding his pencil. That was not who either of them was. What happened was that as the other bidders and observers began to disperse and Pete Calloway packed up his ledger, Hugh fell into step beside Etta as she walked toward where their horses were tied, and neither of them spoke for the better part of a quarter mile, and then Hugh said without preamble, "I want to talk to you about something that has nothing to do with timber." Etta stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. The late afternoon light was catching the angles of his face and making him look less armored than usual, or perhaps he simply was less armored than usual, because whatever wall he had walked across that clearing to demolish, he had demolished it and had not yet rebuilt it. "All right," she said. "I have been in the habit," Hugh said carefully, as though selecting each word from a limited and precious supply, "of treating everyone I might care about as a potential threat. I am aware that this is not a sound basis for anything. I'm also aware that you are not Carolyn and you are not interested in anything I have except my company, which is a thing I have not had the experience of in a very long time." Etta was watching him with an expression that was careful and open at the same time, the way clear water can be both still and running. What I am trying to say, Hugh continued, his jaw working slightly with the unfamiliar effort of it, is that I think I have been wrong about you, about what you represent to me. And I have a habit of not being wrong, which makes this difficult to say. You are wrong about many things, Etta said. You were wrong about women and timber operations. You were wrong about my volume estimate on the North Pocket, which was within 2% of the cruise data Alderton published. You were wrong about the form class on the old larch above the spring, which I told you in June. Yes, he said, the corner of his mouth moved. Those specific failures are documented. And you are not wrong about what you are trying to say, she said quietly. He looked at her. Because I have been saying the same thing to myself for approximately 6 weeks, she said, and I have been trying to arrive at the same conclusion, and I believe I have arrived at it, which is that I did not come to Montana looking for anything except a timber sale and a mill site, and I appear to have found considerably more than that. Hugh Townsend, who had not been moved by anything in 10 years, was moved. He did not say anything immediately. He simply looked at her with those dark eyes that had spent 6 months calibrating exactly what they were seeing, and what they were seeing now was Etta Monroe without the professional distance, without the adversarial framing, without the careful management of proximity, and what they were seeing was a woman who was extraordinary in a way that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with substance. I would like to call on you properly, he said, if that is something you would permit. I would permit it, she said, on the condition that you understand I will not be changing my mill plans to accommodate your schedule. I would not expect you to, he said. And I will continue to operate in the timber market independently. I would be disappointed if you did not. She looked at him for another moment, evaluating. Then she said, all right, Hugh Townsend, come call on me. And that was how it began, properly. The calling on her was an education for both of them. Hugh had called on women before, in the formal sense, in the years since Wisconsin, enough times to satisfy the social expectations of a man in his position in a small valley town. And in each case, he had done it with a kind of managed courtesy that kept the whole proceeding at a safe remove from anything that might grow into real importance. He had been pleasant and he had been punctual, and he had found each time that the managed courtesy had exactly the effect he intended, which was to produce a pleasant and entirely inconsequential courtship that concluded without anyone being particularly damaged. Calling on Etta Monroe was not like this in any respect. She was living in a rented house on the south edge of Stevensville, a small, tidy structure that she had arranged with the kind of functional efficiency that characterized everything she did. A desk covered in notebooks and survey tools, shelves of reference books on forestry and timber mathematics that had traveled with her from Oregon, a kitchen that was adequate and a parlor that showed no particular interest in being decorative, but that had, in spite of itself, a quality of inhabited intelligence that was more welcoming than any arranged parlor he had ever sat in. He came on a Thursday evening, as was arranged, with flowers from the mercantile that he had chosen with greater care than he would have admitted to any living person, and she had made coffee and they had sat across from each other in her parlor, and they had talked for 3 hours. They talked about her father, about the Oregon Coast Range in the spring when the ferns came up under the old fir, and the air had a quality that was almost green, about Hugh's early years in Wisconsin, and what he had been trying to build before it was taken from him, about the hidden motive that had driven Carolyn's father, who had seen Hugh's ambition as a threat to his own established operation, and had used his daughter as the instrument of its neutralization, about the way that kind of betrayal changes a person not just in their dealings with others but in their relationship with their own hope, because if you cannot trust your hope, then you cannot invest in your own future. And if you cannot invest in your own future, then you become merely operational, moving through time efficiently but without direction. Etta had listened to all of this without interrupting, and when he was finished she had said, You have been very efficient for a very long time." "Yes," he had said, "but you came across that clearing today," she had said. "Yes," he had said again. She had looked at him steadily. "What changed?" He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "You did not move. For 4 hours you did not move, and you were not being stubborn, you were just being right. And I realized that I was being stubborn because that is what I do, not because I had a better number. And then I thought about why your number was better, and how it got to be better, and who you are, and what it cost you to be who you are. And I could not in good conscience stay on my side of that clearing any longer." Etta had been quiet for a long moment. The lamplight was warm between them, and outside, the first crickets of the evening were starting up in the meadow grass. "That is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me about something that was not timber," she said. He had left that evening feeling something he had not felt in years, something that he identified, after some internal resistance, as light. Not happy exactly, because happy was too simple. Light, as in the absence of the constant grinding defensive weight he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten. It was not simply the ordinary condition of being alive. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Thursday after that. And then the Tuesdays and Thursdays both became standing events, and then there were Saturday afternoon rides added, and then there was a Sunday dinner at the hotel, and then there was a Sunday dinner at her house, which she had cooked herself with the same methodical competence she brought to everything, and which was excellent in an entirely unsentimental way, good food prepared correctly and without fuss. And Hugh had eaten it and looked at her across the small table and understood that he was in very serious trouble of the best possible kind. The trouble deepened through September. Etta had closed her timber sale and was in the early stages of organizing her logging operation, which was when Hugh, despite his complete and genuine admiration for her professional competence, discovered that admiring someone's competence and watching them attempt to execute a logging operation without adequate equipment and crew were two different experiences. He watched her negotiate with the teamsters and the sawyers and the equipment brokers with a growing, difficult, carefully controlled feeling that he could not decide was professional concern or personal feeling or both simultaneously. It was both simultaneously. He offered his help. He did it carefully, because he understood that she would read the offer with the same precision she brought to everything, and that any hint of condescension or of the original dismissal would end the conversation before it began. He offered it as a business proposition. He had the crew and the equipment and the established contracts. She had the timber and the crew's data and the plan. A partnership on the logging operation would benefit them both in measurable ways. Etta had read the offer for a long, quiet moment. "You understand," she had said, "that I will not be a silent partner in my own operation." "I would find a silent partner extremely dull," he had said. "And any disagreement about method will be resolved through evidence, not seniority. That is the only rational approach." She had considered him for another moment. "All right," she had said, "a partnership, but I want the agreement in writing." "Of course," he had said. They had drawn up a written partnership agreement, which had made Pete Calloway's eyebrows climb considerably when Hugh had stopped in to have it witnessed, but which had also made old Pete smile in the private way of a man who has been watching something develop for months and is pleased to see it arriving at a good place. The logging operation on the Calder bench began in October and was, by every measurable standard, a success. This was not a surprise to Etta, whose volume estimates proved to be accurate to within 3%. It was somewhat more of a surprise to the other timber operators in the valley, who had been skeptical of a woman-led operation and who found themselves reading the sale records in December and revising their skepticism with the particular discomfort of people who have been publicly wrong. It was not a surprise at all to Hugh, who had known from the first time he had looked at Etta's notebook in the larch grove that she was going to be exactly as good as her preparation suggested. What was a surprise to Hugh, a daily ongoing surprise that he had stopped trying to resist, was how much he looked forward to the days on the bench. Not simply the work, though the work was good. Her. Her presence on the bench in the mornings when the mist was still in the trees, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air, and she was walking ahead of him through the timber with her notebook out, reading the forest the way other people read a familiar room, with the ease and absorption of someone who is precisely where they are meant to be. He had kissed her for the first time in late October on the bench, on a day when the larch had gone gold and the valley below was hazy with autumn, and they had been standing at the edge of the cut reviewing her tally sheets, and she had said something funny and precise about the Doyle log rule's systematic underestimation of small logs, and he had been looking at her and laughing, and the laugh had turned into something else, and he had put his hand along her jaw and kissed her once, carefully, and then looked at her to see what she made of it. She had looked at him for a moment. Then she had kissed him back, and it was not careful at all, and he discovered that Etta Monroe, who was careful and precise about practically everything, had apparently decided that this was not an area requiring caution. He was enormously, permanently in favor of this decision. November arrived, and with it the question of the mill site, which was not an abstract question any longer because Etta had the capital from the timber sale, or the beginning of the capital, and the site survey she had completed in the spring, and a supplier in Missoula who had a second-hand water wheel available, and a clear picture of the sawmill design she wanted to build. She was moving faster than Hugh had expected, which he should not have found surprising but did slightly, because the speed and decisiveness of it was still new to him, watching her work. She had put him on notice, with the careful honesty that had become the foundation of everything between them, that the mill would occupy her nearly completely through the winter and spring, and that he should understand that her professional life was not going to accommodate the demands of courtship at the expense of her plans, because those plans had been 8 years in the making, and she was not going to slow them down for any reason. He had told her that he understood this, and he had meant it, and he had gone home that evening and thought about what he was doing with very great seriousness. He was doing the thing he had believed he would never do again. He was trusting someone completely. He was opening the place in himself that had been sealed since Wisconsin, and he was doing it with clear eyes, not with the naive blindness of his younger self, but with full knowledge of what it cost, and full knowledge of what Etta Monroe was, and the conclusion he kept arriving at from every angle of examination was that the cost was worth it, and she was worth it, and he was done being merely operational. He made a decision in late November, and he made it the way he made all his decisions, with complete commitment and without second-guessing, and he went to the Stevensville Mercantile and spent a considerable time with Thomas Aldrich, who sold, in addition to hardware and dry goods, a small selection of jewelry that he kept in a locked case under the counter. What he found in that case was a ring with a small garnet stone in a simple gold setting that was not elaborate or showy, but that had, he thought, a quality of honest beauty that was suited to the woman he was buying it for, and he had bought it and put it in his coat pocket and carried it for 3 days before he did anything with it, because he was going to do this correctly, and the correct moment had to be correct in all its particulars. The correct moment arrived on a Saturday in early December, when the first real snow of the season had come in overnight, and the valley was white and silent under a sky the color of pewter, and Etta had been at her desk since before dawn working on the mill specifications, because she worked like that, in long focused stretches that she had the concentration to sustain. And when he arrived in the morning, she had opened the door with sawdust on her sleeve from working through her reference copies, and ink on her fingers from the drafting, and her hair was coming out of its practical braid on one side, and she had looked at him standing on her doorstep with the snow white and quiet behind him. And she had said, "You are early." "I know," he had said. He had come inside. She had made coffee. They had sat at her desk because her parlor was currently occupied by the sawmill drawings she had spread out to reference, and Hugh had looked at the drawings for a moment because they were remarkable, detailed and correct and precise in the way her work always was, and then he had looked at her. "Etta," he had said. She had looked up from her coffee with the fully present attention she gave to everything, and she had seen something in his face that made her put the coffee cup down. He took the ring out of his pocket and set it on the desk between them. She looked at it for a moment, then at him. "I am not going to tell you that you will be nothing without me," he said, "because that is not true. You are going to build that mill, and it is going to be exactly what you planned, and you do not need me to do any of it. I am not going to tell you that I can offer you security, because you have already secured yourself. I am not going to tell you that I cannot live without you, because I can, and so can you. And we are both old enough to know the difference between a trap dressed up in romantic language and an honest offer." She was watching him very steadily. "What I can tell you," he said, "is that I have spent 10 years building something alone, and it is good work, and it is solid, but it is solitary. And I did not know how solitary until I spent 6 months in your company. And I can tell you that there is no one I would rather argue with for the rest of my life. And I can tell you that I have looked at this from every angle I can find, and the thing I keep finding is that I love you, Etta Monroe, and I would like very much, if you are willing, to be your husband." The silence in the room was the particular silence of a snowy morning, muffled and complete, and the lamp on her desk made a warm island in it. Etta picked up the ring and looked at it carefully, with the same focused attention she brought to a specimen in the field, and then she looked at him, and her expression was the most open he had ever seen it, open in the way of something that has been carefully guarded for a long time and has made the decision to stop guarding. "You said once," she said, "that my volume estimate on the North Pocket was probably more accurate than yours, and you said it because it was true and you are honest. That is not a quality I have encountered often, that honesty." "No," he said, "I have not been looking for a husband," she said. "I want you to understand that. This is not something I had planned." "I know," he said, "but I have also not been not looking for you," she said, which was the most Etta Monroe thing she had ever said, doubly negated and precisely accurate. He understood exactly what she meant. "Is that a yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. "That is a yes." He took the ring from her hand and put it on her finger, and then she looked at it sitting there on her ink-stained hand. And something in her face went completely soft, and she looked up at him with those clear, steady eyes. And he did what he had wanted to do since approximately June, which was pull her toward him and hold her with both arms properly, with the full weight of how he felt about her. And she let him. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft and quiet over the Bitterroot Valley, and somewhere to the west the creek was running under its skim of ice toward the mill site where Etta Monroe was going to build her dream in the spring. And Hugh Townsend held the woman who had outwaited him at a timber sale and was entirely happy about it. The wedding was in March. They had discussed it over the winter, which discussion had involved, as most things they discussed involved, a certain amount of productive disagreement about details. Etta had wanted a small ceremony. Hugh had discovered, to his own moderate surprise, that he had opinions about the wedding that extended slightly beyond small, not because he wanted spectacle, but because the people of Stevensville had watched what had happened between them and had invested themselves in the outcome, and it seemed to him that those people deserved to be present for the resolution. Etta had considered this argument, found it adequate, and agreed to a moderate ceremony at the community church with a dinner afterward at the hotel. It was a beautiful ceremony. Reverend Thomas Whitmore performed it with the dignity and warmth appropriate to the occasion, and old Pete Calloway was in the front pew and cried, which was something no one in the valley had ever seen Pete Calloway do, and which became one of the stories told about the event in subsequent years. Hugh's foreman, a large and generally taciturn man named Ben Garrett, had shaken Hugh's hand afterward with a grip that communicated everything he did not say, which was considerable. The women of the town had made Etta a wedding gift of hand-stitched household linens, with a careful elegance that suggested they had understood something about her that she would not have expected them to see, which was that underneath the competence and the independence was a woman who was, in her way, deeply appreciative of beauty when it arrived in honest forms. Etta wore a dress that was not elaborate but was exactly the right shade of dark green, the color of a Douglas fir in winter, which was not a coincidence. Hugh, standing at the front of the church watching her walk toward him, had the same expression he had worn in the larch grove in June when he had looked at her notebook, the expression of a man revising a previous calculation and finding the revised version enormously superior to the original. They were married on the 15th of March, 1888, in Stevensville, Montana Territory, in front of most of the town, and all the people who had watched them argue their way into love over the course of a remarkable year. Spring came, and with it, the work that Etta had been planning for 8 years. The mill construction began in April, as soon as the ground was workable, and it was a larger undertaking than most of the valley had understood from the outside. Etta had designed a circular sawmill, water-powered from the creek, with a log deck and carriage that incorporated several refinements she had developed from studying existing mill designs in Oregon, and from her own analysis of the inefficiencies common to small portable mill operations. Hugh had contributed the heavy labor force for the construction and his knowledge of the local lumber market and supply chains, and together they had made decisions that neither would have made alone, better decisions, the product of two different kinds of knowledge operating in genuine partnership. Ben Garrett, who had originally been Hugh's foreman, and who was now effectively the operations foreman for the combined enterprise, had adapted to Etta's authority over technical decisions, with a pragmatic acceptance that Hugh privately found both admirable and faintly amusing. Ben was not an imaginative man, but he was an observant one, and he had observed during the winter that Etta Monroe's calculations tended to be correct, and he had filed this observation under the category of relevant professional information and proceeded accordingly. The mill was operational by July 4th, 1888. On that morning, which was bright and warm and smelled of fresh sawdust and creek water, and the particular metallic sweet smell of newly cut lumber, Etta stood at the mill controls for the first cut, and Hugh stood nearby and watched her, and the first log went through the carriage, and the blade found it with a sound like purpose, and the first board fell clean and true and smelling of heartwood. And Etta turned from the controls with sawdust in her hair, and an expression on her face that Hugh had never quite seen before, which was the expression of a person who has arrived, after years of effort and patience, at exactly the place they were always going. He crossed to her and put his arms around her and held her in the middle of the new mill with the wheel turning and the creek running and the smell of fresh lumber around them, and she held him back with her face against his neck, and he could feel in the way she breathed something that had been held for a very long time releasing itself. "You did it," he said into her hair. "We did it," she said. "You designed it and planned it and calculated it and financed it," he said. "I provided some labor." She laughed, which was a sound he had been progressively more in love with since approximately August of the previous year. "Adequate labor," she said. "High praise from you," he said. "It is," she agreed, entirely seriously, and then she kissed him in the middle of their new mill with the sawdust falling around them like pale snow. The mill did exactly what Etta had projected it would do. In its first full operating season, it processed lumber at a rate that placed it among the 3 most productive small mills in the territory. The quality of the lumber, which Etta supervised personally with the same precision she brought to everything, developed a regional reputation. The railroad contractors who had been Hugh's primary customers for years were now buying finished lumber from the Monroe Townsend mill rather than simply rough ties, which was a significantly more profitable product, and the relationship with the Northern Pacific supply contractors expanded rather than contracted as the year went on. The valley's other timber operators had revised their opinions. Not all of them had done so gracefully, and there had been two incidents in the mill's first season when competitors had attempted, through various means of market pressure and rumor, to undermine the operation's standing with buyers. Both attempts had been identified early, because Etta had a talent for reading the patterns in market information that was related to, though not identical with, her ability to read a timber stand, and both had been countered effectively before they could do damage. Hugh had wanted to respond to the second attempt, which had been more aggressive, with the kind of direct confrontation he was temperamentally suited to, and Etta had counseled against it on the grounds that it would cost more than it would gain, and that the best response to an attack on their credibility was simply continued excellence. She had been right, as she was right about most things. Hugh had said so, with the honesty that she had come to depend on, and she had said thank you without false modesty, which was another of the things he loved about her. By the autumn of 1888, they had established a pattern of life that suited them both. They rose early. Etta worked the mill and the books and maintained the timber inventory for their operating area with the methodical discipline of someone for whom attention to detail was not effort but simply the way they were made. Hugh managed the logging operations and the teamster crews and the market relationships and the 100 daily practical problems of a frontier timber and lumber business. In the evenings they were together, at the house on the south edge of Stevensville that Etta had long since stopped renting, and which they had expanded in the early summer with a proper study for her, and a room off the kitchen that Hugh had converted into a workshop for the small mechanical repairs that the mill equipment inevitably required. They argued regularly. This was not a source of difficulty. It was a source of satisfaction to both of them, which was a thing that surprised some of their neighbors, but which made complete sense to anyone who knew them well. Their arguments were the arguments of two intelligent people who had strong and well-founded opinions, and who were not afraid to defend those opinions, while remaining genuinely open to being wrong. Every significant business decision they made went through at least one such argument, and the decisions that emerged from those arguments were reliably better than the decisions either of them would have made alone. Ben Garrett, who witnessed many of these arguments in the course of his foreman duties, and who had developed a philosopher's equanimity about the process, had told his wife that working for the Townsends was like working for two people who were having one long, extremely productive conversation. His wife had told him that was the most romantic thing she had ever heard him say. Ben had been puzzled by this. In the winter of 1888, Etta told Hugh that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the way she told him important things, directly and without preparation, because she had found that direct delivery worked best for both of them. She was sitting at her desk with her accounts open in front of her, and he had come in from the mill yard, and she had looked up and said, without preamble, "I need to tell you something." Hugh had felt something in his chest do a complicated thing. She had told him. He had sat down on the edge of her desk, which was not structurally advisable and which she would have noted under ordinary circumstances, and he had looked at her for a long moment. "Are you all right?" he had said. "I am entirely well," she had said, with the calm specificity that was the Etta Monroe version of reassurance. "I have been to see Dr. Prentice, and he confirms it and indicates the spring, most likely May." "May," Hugh had said. "Yes." He had reached across the desk and taken her hand, the one with the garnet ring, and held it for a moment, and she had turned her hand over and held his back. "Are you glad?" she had asked, and there had been something in her voice that was not quite vulnerable, because Etta Monroe was not quite vulnerable in the ordinary sense, but that was real and careful in a way that told him the question mattered. "Etta," he had said, "I am the gladest I have ever been." She had looked at him steadily. "I intend to continue operating the mill," she had said, "through the reasonable period of my confinement and after Dr. Prentice finds no medical objection." "I would not expect otherwise," he had said. The gladness in his voice was unmistakable, and she had heard it, and something in her face had gone luminous for a moment, briefly and completely. And then she had looked back at her accounts because there were numbers to check, and he had sat on her desk for another moment holding her hand before going back to the mill yard. Their son was born in late May of 1889, which was the same spring that Montana was on the verge of territorial statehood, the whole territory holding its breath against the November that would bring it fully into the Union. Etta had, characteristically, planned for the birth with the same organizational thoroughness she brought to everything, and she had arranged for Mrs. Alderton, whose husband ran the land office and who was the valley's most experienced midwife, to be available, and she had kept a precise record of her symptoms and progress that Dr. Prentice had found more useful than any patient notes he had received in a decade of practice. The labor was long and difficult. Hugh, who had faced timber falls and early ice and financial pressure with steadiness, found that sitting outside the bedroom door while Etta worked at something he could not help her with was a form of difficulty he was not equipped for. And Ben Garrett, who had come to the house because he had heard in town and had nowhere else to put himself, sat with him on the porch steps for several hours in the spring morning, and they did not talk much, but Ben's solid presence was something Hugh was grateful for. When Mrs. Alderton came to the door in the early afternoon and told Hugh he had a son, he stood up from the porch steps and stood very still for a moment, and Ben quietly took himself around the side of the house to give him the moment, and Hugh stood in the spring air with the sound of the creek and the smell of the new green, and understood that whatever he had built and whatever he had planned and whatever had happened to him before, this was the thing that mattered most. He went in to see Etta. She was holding the child, and she looked exhausted in a way Hugh had never seen her look before, exhausted and absolutely incandescent, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that was entirely unlike her ordinary expression, stripped of all its professional composure, just her, just Etta, wholly herself in this extraordinary moment. "He is healthy," she said. "Mrs. Alderton confirms it. 7 pounds and some. Strong lungs." As if on cue, the child demonstrated the strong lungs with a brief and comprehensive editorial. Hugh sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and at his wife and felt something so far beyond any previous version of glad that he did not have a word for it. "What do we name him?" Etta asked. They had discussed names. They had not agreed. This was not a surprise. "I keep coming back to Joseph," Hugh said. "For your father." Etta looked at him. Her father had died 3 years earlier before she had come to Montana, and she did not speak of him often, but when she did there was something in her voice that was close to reverence, the reverence of a student for a teacher who had given them everything that mattered. "Joseph," she said. "Yes." Her voice was quiet and full. "Joseph Hugh Townsend." "I am in favor of that," Hugh said. "The baby was named Joseph Hugh Townsend, and he came into the world in May of 1889, in a Montana spring that smelled of fir and snowmelt and fresh lumber, and he had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw and the general disposition," Mrs. Alderton reported to the town, "of a person who intended to make his opinions known on any subject that arose." Montana became a state in November of 1889. The Townsend Mill processed a significant run of lumber for the state courthouse being built in Helena the following year, which was a contract that Etta had identified and pursued and negotiated with her characteristic combination of precise knowledge and complete professional calm, and which established the Monroe Townsend operations reputation beyond the Bitterroot Valley. The years that followed were good years. They were not easy years, because nothing in Montana Territory, newly minted as a state, was easy, and the timber business had its own rhythms of market pressure and weather and labor difficulty and equipment failure that required constant, intelligent management. There were hard winters and dry summers and a forest fire in the summer of 1891 that came within 2 miles of the mill, and required a week of continuous work from every able body in the valley to contain. There were market downturns and contract disputes, and one very difficult year when a supplier defaulted and left them financially exposed in a way that required creative restructuring to survive. They survived all of it. They survived it because Etta was brilliant, and because Hugh was tough, and because together they were something more than the sum of those qualities. The combination of her analytical intelligence and his operational experience, and the absolute trust they had built over years of honest dealing with each other, producing a resilience that neither of them could have managed alone. Joseph grew. He grew the way children of the frontier grew, in the proximity of work and weather, and the particular education of parents who took ideas seriously. And by the time he was walking confidently, he had a habit of following his mother around the mill with a focused attention that made Hugh, watching from a distance, feel something that was approximately the emotion of a man watching two of the people he loves most in the world being entirely themselves. In the spring of 1892, Etta told Hugh she was expecting again. This time she told him at dinner, and he reached across the table and took her hand, and they looked at each other with the look of people who have been through enough together to understand that every good thing is also a responsibility, and every joy arrives with its full weight, and they were glad. Their second child was a daughter, born in October of 1892, and named Rosalind after the grandmother who had been Etta's mother's mother, a woman Etta had never met but whose name appeared in the letter her father had written her the month before his death as the name of the woman who had given him the quality of mind that he had in turn given Etta. Rosalind Townsend arrived in October with red hair that was a surprise to everyone, including Mrs. Alderton, who had delivered a great many babies in the Bitterroot Valley, and maintained that red hair always surprised her, and with a temperament that from the first weeks of her life suggested she would have opinions about everything and the energy to express them, which Hugh said was exactly like her mother, and Etta said was exactly like her father and Joseph, who was 3 years old and had been waiting for the baby with patient intensity, examined his sister with the focused assessment of a small person conducting serious research, and then announced that she would do. The valley had grown around them. Stevensville in 1892 was a different place than it had been in 1887, larger and more settled and connected by better roads to the growing towns along the railroad. The world was changing. The timber industry was changing with it, becoming larger and more organized, with Eastern capital beginning to move into the Mountain West and change the scale of operations. Hugh and Etta watched this development carefully, with the watchfulness of people who have built something they intend to protect. They made adjustments. They specialized. Etta had developed, over the years of the mill's operation, an expertise in graded lumber for finish carpentry and furniture that occupied a niche above the raw commodity market, and that was less vulnerable to the price pressure that came with large-scale industrialization. Hugh had built relationships with the smaller contractors and builders who valued quality and consistency over pure volume, the kind of relationships that held through market downturns because they were built on trust and delivered value. It was a good business. More importantly, it was their business, built by their combined efforts, expressing the best of what both of them could do, and that ownership, that shared authorship, was something neither of them ever took for granted. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, in March of 1893, Hugh had come home from the mill yard to find Etta at her desk, as she often was in the evenings, but not working. She was sitting with her hands folded on the open notebook in front of her, and she was looking out the window at the mountain across the valley, where the snow line was still high, and the upper peaks were catching the last of the sunset, that extraordinary mountain light that had a way of making everything it touched look both exactly itself and more itself than ordinary day could reveal. He had stopped in the doorway. She had not heard him, or had heard him and was not disturbed by him, which amounted to the same thing, which was that she was somewhere that was not quite the room but that was entirely peaceful, and the expression on her face was one he had seen sometimes in the early mornings on the bench, when she was in the middle of the old timber and simply being where she was. He had gone in and sat down beside her without speaking, and she had turned to look at him with that expression still on her face, open and without the professional composure, just the underlying Etta, the one who had shown him her notebook in the larch grove and changed the calculation. 5 years, she had said. 5 years, he had agreed. She had been quiet for a moment. I did not plan any of this, she had said. I want you to know that I am aware of the strangeness of that. I'm a person who plans. I planned everything. The methodology, the mill, the financing, I had every variable mapped. Except me, he had said. Except you, she had agreed. You were entirely outside my planning. You were a business competitor. You were the most stubborn man at the timber sale. You were an obstacle I intended to wait out and then proceed past. And instead, he had said. And instead, she had said, and looked at him with those clear gray eyes that had been reading him with perfect accuracy for 5 years now, you are the best thing I did not plan. Hugh Townsend, who had spent a decade learning not to let anything reach him, had been reached completely, and had no objection to it whatsoever. He had put his arms around his wife in the golden late light of their March evening, and she had leaned into him in the way that she had of leaning, not as a person seeking support, but as a person choosing to rest against something she trusted completely, which was different and which meant more to him than any version of need could have. I withdrew my bid, he said, because you were right and I knew it and I was tired of standing across the clearing from you. You withdrew your bid, she said, because after 40 years of stubbornness you had your first rational moment. 5 years, he said, and the best compliment you have ever given me is calling me rational. She laughed. The lamplight was warm, and the fire was going in the kitchen and somewhere in the back of the house. Their children were sleeping. Joseph in his small bed with one of Etta's survey notebooks on the floor beside him. Rosalind in her crib with the red hair brilliant against the pillow. And the mill was standing on the creek where Etta had always meant to build it. And the Bitterroot Mountains were going purple and deep with evening outside the window. They were, Hugh Townsend thought, holding his wife in the last light of their 5th anniversary, precisely where they were supposed to be. Not because of fate or fortune, but because two very stubborn, very honest people had stood on opposite sides of a clearing for 4 hours, and then one of them had walked across. He had walked across. She had let him come. Everything else had followed from that. The following spring brought another round of mill contracts and another survey season, and young Joseph, who had turned 4 and who had his mother's eyes and her gift for careful observation, and his father's absolute refusal to accept an incomplete answer to any question, began accompanying Etta on her shorter field surveys with the small calibrated stick she had cut for him from a straight piece of larch, showing him, as her father had showed her, how to look at a tree and see not just what it was but what it contained. Hugh watched this sometimes, the two of them in the field, his wife crouching beside their son with her notebook open, and the boy studying the tree with that concentrated Etta expression on his small face, and he felt something that had no name in any language he knew, which was the feeling of watching the thing that mattered most in your life being perfectly, completely itself. Rosalind, at 1.5 years, was already demonstrating what Mrs. Alderton called a formidable personality, and what Hugh, with affectionate resignation, recognized as the specific variety of formidable he had met across a timber sale clearing 7 years earlier, which was not the formidable of aggression or domination, but the formidable of a person who had decided, very early and very completely, exactly what they thought about everything. Ben Garrett, who had been with them through all of it, through the partnership and the wedding and the mill construction and the fire of '91 and the hard winter of '92, who had watched Hugh Townsend become a husband and a father with the steady attention of a man who had always known his employer was capable of more than he was allowing himself, said to his wife one evening in the spring of 1894 that he had never seen anyone so thoroughly improved by being outstubborned at a timber sale. His wife agreed with him, which was notable because she agreed with Ben on perhaps one subject in five, and she said furthermore that Etta Monroe Townsend was the best thing that had happened to the Bitterroot Valley's timber economy and to Hugh Townsend personally, and that the two things were not unrelated, because a person who is right in one part of their life tends to be more right in other parts of it as well. This was, Ben thought, probably the wisest thing his wife had ever said, which was saying something because she said wise things with some regularity. The years settled into each other with the comfortable quality of a life that is being lived correctly. There were difficulties and recoveries, and the ordinary texture of a business and a family in a place that was still finding its shape. Montana in the 1890s was a place of extraordinary contradiction, beautiful and brutal, full of people making enormous efforts and sometimes failing and sometimes succeeding, and always shaped by the land and the weather and the inexorable pressure of a nation expanding westward with more appetite than wisdom. Etta was aware of the injustices of that expansion. She had seen what the railroad had done to the land and to the communities of the Salish people who had lived in the Bitterroot Valley for generations before any of them arrived, and she did not pretend that her mill or her timber sales were separate from those forces. She held that awareness carefully, without the false comfort of believing her own good intentions made her exempt from the larger moral accounting. It was one of the things Hugh respected most about her, that she did not simplify the world into categories that were convenient for herself. They were part of what was happening in Montana, for good and for ill, and the best they could do was to do their part well and honestly, and to acknowledge the cost of what they participated in. It was not enough, and they both knew it, but it was what they had, and they brought to it the same honesty they brought to everything else. In the autumn of 1895, when Joseph was 6 and Rosalind was nearly 3, and the mill had been running for 7 years, and the Monroe Townsend operation had become one of the most respected small lumber operations in western Montana, Etta came to Hugh with a new plan. She had been working on it quietly, in the way she worked on things she was still developing, and when she laid it out for him, it was already detailed and calculated and cross-referenced with the current market data, because she did not bring incomplete things to discussions when she could help it. The plan was to diversify. The railroad tie market was changing. The large Eastern operators were beginning to dominate it in ways that made it increasingly difficult for small operations to compete on volume, and Etta had identified a market for high-grade finished lumber and custom milling that was growing with the region's population, and that played directly to the quality capabilities of their mill and the expertise she had developed. Hugh had read through her analysis. He had asked questions. She had answered them. He had asked more questions, and she had answered those too, and pushed back on 2 of his assumptions with data that revised them, and he had sat with it for a day and come back with his own additions, his knowledge of the contractor relationships and the logistics network adding dimensions to her market analysis that sharpened its conclusions. They had argued about the capital requirements for 3 evenings running. He thought she was being too conservative. She thought his growth projections were too aggressive. They had arrived at a number that was between them, which upon subsequent examination proved to be essentially correct, which was the usual outcome of their arguments, and which they had both learned to appreciate rather than finding merely coincidental. The diversification worked. By 1897, the Monroe Townsend mill was known across the territory for the quality of its finished lumber, and Etta had developed a grading methodology that became something of a regional standard, adopted by 2 other mills in the valley after the operators came to her and asked, with varying degrees of awkward self-consciousness, whether she would be willing to share it. She shared it. She charged them a fair consulting fee for the explanation and documentation, because she was not sentimental about the value of her professional knowledge, and she shared it because she believed, as her father had believed, that a rising standard in the industry served everyone, including her, better than hoarded advantage. One of the operators who came to her was a man who had been among those who had tried to undermine her operation in 1888. He had come to her house with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had made a specific kind of journey to arrive at this moment. And Etta had invited him in and discussed the methodology with him for 2 hours with complete professional courtesy, because that was who she was, and the consulting fee he paid was fair, and the business relationship that followed it was productive, and nothing more was said about 1888. Hugh had watched this particular meeting from the mill yard, and had thought that the most impressive thing about Etta Monroe Townsend, in a very long list of impressive things, was that she did not hold grudges. She held accounts, precise and accurate accounts of what had happened and what it had cost, but she did not hold grudges, which was a different thing entirely, and the distinction said everything about the quality of her character. The summer of 1898 brought a heat that settled over the valley in late July like a hand pressed down on the land, dry and insistent, and with it came a new development. The children were 9 and 5 now. Joseph, who had been walking timber surveys with his mother since he was 4, could already read a Biltmore stick and had a grasp of basic tree measurement that would not have embarrassed a professional twice his age. Rosalind was doing something slightly different, which was developing an extremely specific and total commitment to the horses in the livery stable 2 blocks from their house, where she spent every available hour, and from which she had to be retrieved on a daily basis by whoever noticed she had gone missing. Hugh found this mildly alarming and deeply characteristic, and had long since made a standing arrangement with the livery owner, a patient man named Caldwell, to send his daughter home at intervals. That summer, in August, Etta and Hugh had taken the children up to the Calder bench. It was the first time either of the children had been to the bench, and they went on a clear morning when the mountains were sharp against a sky, so blue it looked painted, and they had walked together through the second-growth timber that was coming back in the years since the original harvest, young trees now a decade old, reaching for the light with the particular energy of trees that have been given room. Etta had walked ahead with Joseph, showing him the regrowth, explaining the succession process in the quiet, precise way she explained everything, and Hugh had walked behind with Rosalind, who was riding on his shoulders with her red hair blowing and her hands in his, and her general commentary on the proceedings delivered into the top of his head. At the place where the old larch grove had been, where he and Etta had stood in June of 1887 and he had looked at her notebook and revised the calculation, there were young larch coming up in the openings, 10 feet tall and straight and quick, the silver-gold needles catching the morning sun. He had stopped there and looked at them. Etta had turned from her conversation with Joseph and looked at him, and then looked at the young trees, and her expression had done the thing it did sometimes, the thing that stripped the professional composure and left just her, the person underneath the expertise, the person who had walked into this valley 8 years ago with a plan, and had found, in the middle of an argument over timber volume at the Calder bench timber sale, something she had not planned at all. She had walked back through the young larch to stand beside him, and they had stood together in that place that meant what it meant to them and looked at the new trees growing where the old ones had been, the forest renewing itself with patient persistence, season by season, decade by decade, the way good things renew themselves when they are given room. Rosalind had wanted to know why everyone had stopped walking. Joseph had explained, with the grave accuracy of a 9-year-old who had been listening to adults carefully for most of his life, that this was a special place. Why? Rosalind had asked. Because Joseph had said, with the confidence of someone imparting a fact he had recently assembled from available data, this was where Mama waited out Papa at the timber sale, and he gave her the price she wanted, and then they eventually got married, and then they got us. Hugh had looked at Etta. Etta had looked at Hugh. She could have corrected the historical account on several points, not least the question of what the timber sale had been about, and what the courtship had looked like, and what exactly had been given to whom. But she looked at her husband's face in the morning light of the Calder bench in the place where it had begun, and she decided that Joseph's version was, in the ways that mattered, accurate enough. "Yes," she said, "something like that." Hugh's hand found hers among the young larch. She held it, and Rosalind demanded to be told more about the timber sale, because she had not been paying sufficient attention to the first account, and Joseph launched into an expanded version with supplementary details. And somewhere in the canopy above them, a nuthatch was working its way down a tree trunk in the particular upside-down way nuthatches have, and the sun was warm on the bench, and the valley spread below them in the long, lovely light of a Montana summer morning. And everything that had been built between them stood solid and real and alive as the new timber growing in the old ground. Hugh Townsend, who had been the most stubborn man at the timber sale, looked at the woman who had waited him out with her notebook and her numbers and her 8 years of patient, fierce, brilliant preparation, and felt, with the clarity of a man who has been wrong about something important and has been given the extraordinary grace of being corrected, that everything in his life had pointed toward this. Toward this bench, this light, this woman's hand in his, these children growing up in the sound of a mill that she had built, and a business that they had built together, in a valley that had watched them find each other in the particular combative, honest, ultimately inevitable way that two strong and worthy people sometimes find each other, which is by being entirely themselves until the distance between them is no longer tenable. She had named her price at the timber sale, and he had recognized the truth of it, and he had walked across the clearing, and she had let him come. That was the whole of it, and it was everything.